Trump's hitting back, doubling tariffs on aluminum and steel, coming into effect as soon as tomorrow.
Absolutely. What we're seeing, in my view, in real time, this is history unfolding before our eyes, is we've been told for months upon months by the every cabinet minister in Ottawa in the national Liberal government, and not to be partisan whatsoever, because I'm not, Premier Ford, the Conservative Premier, has parroted the same line. And that line was, we must retaliate. We must engage in retaliatory tariffs because this will force Donald Trump to back down. Chrétien said it on Sunday night. So did Prime Minister Trudeau. So did Prime Minister-elect Carney. So has Freeland said it. So has every other cabinet minister. So has Premier Doug Ford. They have never deviated. This is the only route forward, that we must hit them hard with the retaliatory tariffs because we can stand up our 2.5 trillion GDP economy and take on the US almost 30 trillion GDP economy, the world hegemon, and we can get them to back down. That's how much power is implicit in this assumption. And what we saw today is exactly the opposite. Well, we've seen it for several weeks, I would argue, but today it's become crystal clear. And Rudyard, I want to put this out there because people would say, well, this is just your opinion. This is just your interpretation. You're just one professor. I did an op-ed in the National Post 2-3 weeks ago that was an analysis, interpretation of a paper published at the end of November 2024 by Stephen Marin. Stephen Marin is now the chief economist to President Trump in the White House. His technical title is the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, first created by Richard Nixon. And that position is the chief economist to the President of the United States. In this paper, long, dense paper, 41 pages, he explicitly in black and white stated, we are going to impose tariffs on those countries around the world, friend and foe alike, that protect parts of their economy and do not allow American corporations to enter their markets. But he went further. We already knew about that. I mean, I think there's people that acknowledge now that even in the Liberal government in Ottawa, and Premier Ford acknowledged that he said that. But he went further. He said, we realize some countries will retaliate, will respond with retaliatory tariffs. This Stephen Marin said.
Yeah.
And if they do, he said, we will jack up the tariffs and hit them even harder and stronger because we are the largest economy in the world and just about everybody wants to deal and access our economy. So he anticipated what the Liberal government in Ottawa is saying and what the Premier of Ontario and some other premiers are saying, that we would retaliate. And he said basically, and we'll retaliate, come back, and we'll hit you even harder. And we'll basically, was saying between the lines, we will bring those countries to their knees until they open up their economy. So what we are seeing today is a catastrophic failure, in my judgment, of the national political leadership of Canada in refusing to acknowledge these fundamental facts.
And a very different strategy, let's say, than Mexico, who has and China to a certain extent, who have, held off, or when they've enacted tariffs, they've been targeted. They certainly haven't antagonized in the way that it seems our provincial leaders. And it's interesting, again, Ian, that it's kind of like our national government doesn't exist here, and we've got provinces kind of freelancing in an area where you would hope that there would be some national strategy and some national coordination.
Exactly. I mean, this begs for a national leadership. But, Rudyard, why I'm so deeply skeptical and possibly depressed about this is that, to put a bigger backstory on this, a bigger context, I've argued in other papers I've done that we have gone down the wrong road for the last 50 to 70 years, roughly since 1970, if you want to put a time frame on it. And I've summarized it into a little, soundbite, I guess we would call it today, that the policy framework of the government of Canada for the last 50, 60, 70 years has been subsidize, protect, and regulate. And we believed, as the national strategy, we could regulate and subsidize and protect our way to national prosperity.
Yeah.
And what we've seen over a long period of time is the gradual decline of our competitiveness, the gradual statistical, factual decline of our productivity. At one point, it was at 90% of US level, because we always benchmarked against the US. Then it came down to 80. We're now down, according to Professor Tombe of University of Calgary, we're down to about 50%. Carolyn Rogers, no, she is certainly not a partisan. She's the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, and the governor was appointed by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Published a speech a year ago, delivered a speech called Time to Break the Glass, where she summarized all of the negative policies that we've adopted over the years, including protectionism, including failure to diversify our country and seek out new markets abroad, interprovincial trade barriers. The list goes on and on and on. And these things have to be corrected. What we're seeing instead by the national leadership and Premier Ford is an attempt to, I believe, change the topic, because they don't want to change those policies.
Right.
So they've changed
the interprovincial trade
Donald
barriers.
Trump is a bad man. He's trying to hurt us, so we've got to retaliate against him, which is exactly the wrong thing that we should be doing.
No, we should be welcoming the potential for greater competition, liberalization in our own economy. Ian, what do you think the economic consequences of this now accelerating trade spat? And again, I want to remind viewers, President Trump is saying that in response to Ontario's 25% levy on electricity imported into the United States, he will be slapping Canada with a doubling of the previously announced aluminum and steel tariffs. They will be at 50%. And Ian, he said today in the same tweet that as of April 1st, there will be significant tariffs on the Canadian auto sector. And he was explicit in that tweet in saying that he wants that production to come back to the United States.
It should terrify every Canadian. I hope that we wake up very, very quickly and stop following the Pied Pipers that are taking us down this tariff doom loop that's going to lead us into a recession. To answer your question, I believe this is going to lead us into a recession. It's not going to be like the pandemic, as many people claim. It's a cyclical thing. It's not, as Governor Macklem pointed out in that excellent speech in Mississauga Oakville Chamber of Commerce last week, that this will be a permanent reduction in our standard of living. It's going to be a structural transformation. We are looking, because of this intransigence and this refusal by our national leadership to act in a responsible manner for the greater public good, and that's both liberal and conservative politicians. What they are doing is risking the national prosperity that we built up over 150 years by not acknowledging that we must pivot. We must open up the economy. We must say, look, we want to get to the negotiating table to renegotiate a new CUSMA, but it's going to be much bigger than the past CUSMA or NAFTA. It's not only going to deal with protected industries that we must open up. But we've got to deal with the border. We've got to deal with illegal immigration, illegal guns, illegal drugs. We've got to have a comprehensive treaty with the United States. And for those who say, well, Donald Trump's not going to negotiate with us. He's already said so in the Marin speech. He will once we open up. And secondly, he already did sign a new CUSMA, so the empirical record is that he did do it. And thirdly, the alternative being proposed by Ottawa and Mayor Doug Ford are so catastrophic that they're unthinkable, and yet that's our national policy right now.
So, Ian, just to wrap up here, I mean, if one really wanted to be cynical, you could argue that this sudden rush into retaliatory tariffs and an escalation of this trade war as much by Canada now as the United States is precisely because the status quo doesn't want to change. And, you know, we're seeing it, Ian, from all these companies, oligopolies, duopolies, the managed competition that you so aptly described has defined the Canadian economy for the last 40 years or more. They're wrapping themselves in the Canadian flag. They're saying, buy Canadian. They're saying, don't, in effect, de facto, don't allow U.S. competition into our markets because we now have to become self-sufficient, independent from the United States. It might be interesting, just as we wrap up, for our viewers to hear from you why you think that really is a non-starter, the so-called third option is something we should just burn out of our minds as we try to think our way through this crisis.
Right. The I've called this, I've actually talked about this for 35 years teaching, and I've talked about it in many of my media interviews from time to time. I've talked about the slow, gradual Argentinization of Canada. And I use Argentina, but rather, I'm not going to use, some inflammatory model like the collapse of the Soviet Union or something like that. Argentina, and this has been widely studied, The Economist magazine did a cover story on this several months ago. Argentina in 1918 was one of the wealthiest countries on planet Earth with one of the highest average incomes per person, GDP per capita, which is one of the key metrics to analyze the wealth, to compare the wealth of nations of one country to another. And yet, after the famous regime of Isabel and Juan Perón, over the next 50 years, they managed to take that from a very wealthy first world country down to a very unsuccessful, failing, developing or third world country. Today, if anyone wants to look it up, the average income per capita in Argentina is $14,000 US. And they did things like protect, exclude foreign direct investment, regulate, confiscatory rates of taxation, capital gains tax, and many of the things we've been doing. They did it much more aggressively and much more successfully than we did. We've just taken a longer time to do it. One more quick point, Roger, before we run out of time. Because some people, I'm sure, will say, well, that's just ideology. Just across the pond, there's this place called the European Union. I'm sure we all know about it. And Mario Draghi, who is no conservative whatsoever, very distinguished liberal, the former governor of the European Central Bank, PhD, economics, MIT, thank you, and the Premier of Italy, thank you, wrote a devastating critique on the website of the European Commission, and he calls it the crisis of the European Union. And when you go through that crisis, their productivity is collapsing like Canada, their competitiveness is collapsing, their failure to innovate is getting worse and worse, just like it is in Canada. And he argues that if they don't change, they're going to become much more poor. Their standard of living is going to go down. And when I read that report, I thought many of the things he's saying can be said exactly about Canada. So that policy that we believed in, many people believed in for the past 50, 60, 70 years, subsidize, protect, and regulate, is before our eyes collapsing. It's not a viable alternative unless we want to become the next Argentina or some variant thereto. Yeah. This idea we can become autarkic, remind everyone, there's the most successful country in the world for autarky is North Korea. And it is one of the poorest countries in the world, saying we don't buy from anybody, we don't depend on anybody outside of North Korea. And that is not a policy, and I know nobody's advocating North Korea. I'm saying this policy of we're going to go it alone and become self-sufficient as if we can make everything we need in a country of 40 million. That's just nonsense. Countries import from other countries because we can't make everything inside our own country. So that's where the choice we face. It's very stark. Either we open up our economy, we get rid of that digital service tax that is so angering to the Americans, we increase our defense spending, or we are going to be in a permanent lower state of a state of much lower standard of living and incomes for the foreseeable future.
Well, Ian Lee at the Sprott School of Business, thanks for coming on Trump's Trade War, our regular program here at the Hub, featuring the best commentary and insight published in the Hub. Ian was in our pages today, so you can check them out right now at www.thehub.ca, and we will keep these videos coming at you as this fast developing story continues to morph. Big new tariffs arriving tomorrow on steel and aluminum. Wow, Ian, it's consequential times. As you said, history is being made. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Back to you soon. Bye-bye.